She fired him at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. By 9:03, he was the only thing standing between her daughter and a professional kidnapping team. Evelyn Marlowe had spent 12 years building a billion-dollar empire on one belief: she could read anyone in under 4 minutes. She prided herself on it. She had terminated executives, dropped investors, and ended partnerships based on that instinct alone. She was almost never wrong. But on that Tuesday morning, in a concrete parking garage beneath her own building, Evelyn Marlowe made the worst judgment call of her life. And the man she dismissed without a second glance was the only reason her daughter came home that night. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means the world to us to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. The car always arrived at 7:15. Not 7:14. Not 7:16. 7:15 pulled tight against the curb outside Evelyn Marlowe's brownstone on Caldwell Street, engine idling, rear door aligned precisely with the 3 stone steps that led down from her front entrance. Adrian Cole had been doing this for 4 months without a single deviation. He was not the kind of driver who made conversation. He didn't comment on the weather or ask about her meetings or offer opinions on traffic. When Evelyn climbed into the back seat, he acknowledged her with a nod. Just barely, just enough, checked the mirrors, and drove. Sometimes she was on the phone for the entire 40-minute commute. Sometimes she worked on her tablet, fingers moving fast across documents while the city slid past outside. He never interrupted, never asked if she needed anything, never spoke unless spoken to, which was, in her mind, exactly what made him adequate. Not excellent, not remarkable, adequate. Evelyn Marlowe did not have time for people who were merely adequate, but she also didn't have the bandwidth to constantly vet drivers. And Adrian Cole had come with clean references, a spotless record, and a face that was easy to forget, broad-shouldered, quiet, with dark eyes that seemed to be looking at something just past whatever was in front of him. He was 37 and looked it. Not in a worn-out way, but in the way of a man who had spent time outdoors doing something that wasn't recreational. She had never asked what. She had a company to run. Marlowe Equity Group occupied the top 4 floors of the Harlan Building, a glass and steel tower in the financial district that Evelyn had chosen specifically because you could see it from 3 different expressway approaches. She liked being visible. She had fought too hard and too long to be anything else. At 30, she had launched Marlowe Equity with borrowed capital and one client who believed in her more than she believed in herself. Now, a decade later, the company managed over $4 billion in assets, employed more than 300 people, and had Evelyn's face on the cover of 2 national business magazines in the past 18 months. She did not take mornings lightly. Tuesday, the morning in question, had started normally enough. She had been awake since 5. Her daughter Lila, 8 years old and currently obsessed with an illustrated book series about a girl who could speak to animals, had appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15 wearing mismatched socks and asking if they could get a dog. "We've talked about this," Evelyn said, pouring coffee. "We've talked about it, but you haven't said yes yet." "That's not the same as not talking about it." "Mom, a dog." "Lila." Her daughter had retreated to her room to finish getting dressed, and Evelyn had made a mental note, the same mental note she'd been making for 3 months, to actually think about the dog question seriously. At some point. When she had a free hour. The morning briefing was scheduled for 8. She needed to be at her desk by 7:45. Adrian was at the curb at 7:15 as always, and they pulled into traffic without incident. Then, somewhere around the intersection of 5th and Meridian, Adrian quietly turned left instead of right. Evelyn looked up from her tablet. "You missed the turn." "There's a jackknifed freight carrier on Meridian blocking 3 lanes," he said, his voice the same low, uninflected tone it always was. "I'm going around through Ashford. We'll still make it." She looked out the window. The streets around Ashford ran through the old warehouse district, quieter, no stoplights between 9th and the bridge, and this time of morning, nearly empty. He wasn't wrong about the timing. They arrived at the Harlan Building at 7:41, 14 minutes earlier than her usual arrival. She sat in the back seat for a moment after the car stopped. "I didn't ask you to change the route." Adrian glanced in the rearview mirror. No, you didn't. Then why did you? Because it was the faster way. Something about the way he said it, not defensive, not apologetic, just matter of fact, as though this were a reasonable thing to explain to a reasonable person, irritated her in a way she didn't fully understand yet. That's not your decision to make, she said. I pay for a specific service. I set the route. You follow it. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything. He just held her gaze in the mirror for 1 second, then looked away. She got out of the car. She fired him at 8:47. By then, she had sat through her morning briefing, reviewed 2 pending acquisition proposals, and approved a revised compensation structure for the operations team. She had also spent 45 minutes doing what she always did when something was bothering her, turning it over in her mind, examining it from different angles, deciding what it meant. What it meant, she concluded, was this. A driver who made unilateral decisions about routes would eventually make unilateral decisions about other things. Independence unchecked was unpredictability, and unpredictability was a liability. She called building management and had them send a note to the garage. Adrian was asked to come up at 8:40. He arrived at her office 7 minutes later and stood in the doorway with his jacket on, like a man who had already suspected what the meeting would be about. I'm letting you go, Evelyn said. She didn't look up from her desk immediately. When she did, his expression hadn't changed. The route decision this morning, she said. That's not how this works. You have one job. Follow the schedule, follow the route. That's it. The route I took got you here faster. I understand that. Without it, you would have been late. Adrian, she set her pen down. I'm not debating this with you. Your contract is terminated. HR will process your final payment. You can collect your things from the locker room. He looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with the wounded expression of someone caught off guard, more like a man cataloging something, storing it somewhere quiet and private. Then he nodded once. All right, he said, and he left. She went back to her emails. She did not feel guilty because guilt required doubt, and she had none. The decision had been clear. The reasoning was sound. Adrian Cole was a driver who didn't follow instructions. That was the beginning and end of it. She had one more internal call at 9 o'clock, a 30-minute budget review that always ran over. She pulled up her notes and started refreshing herself on the numbers. At 8:58, she got a text from her assistant, Diana. Lila's school pickup was moved to this morning, remember? The play rehearsal schedule changed. Marcos was supposed to get her from the aftercare building at 9. He just called in sick. I didn't know until now. I'm so sorry. Evelyn stared at the screen. The aftercare building was the small annex attached to the back of Lila's school. A separate entrance, a separate parking area, less visible from the main road. Lila was always dropped there during schedule changes because it was closer to the building's back elevator. It was also, she realized, accessed through the underground garage. Her underground garage. She was already standing up when her desk phone rang. It was building security. Ms. Marlowe. The voice on the other end was unnaturally controlled, in the way that people forced themselves to sound controlled when they were anything but. We have a situation in the lower garage. You need to come down, now. She took the service elevator because the attendant at the desk held the door open for her and the stairwell was faster, but her legs felt wrong, too fast and not fast enough at the same time. And she was still holding her phone in one hand from Diana's text. The underground garage was 3 levels below street grade. It smelled of concrete and exhaust, and the particular cold that collected in low places. The lights down there were fluorescent and pale, and they turned everything slightly greenish. She heard voices before she reached the 3rd level. Then she heard Lila. Not screaming, not crying out for help, just her daughter's voice, strained and frightened and higher than usual, saying, "Stop, let go, stop." Evelyn rounded the corner at a run. What she saw would take her a long time to process into coherent pieces. In the moment, it came at her in fragments. An unmarked black SUV pulled nose first toward the exit ramp. 4 men, no, 5, adult males in nondescript clothing, the kind of clothing designed not to be remembered, and Lila, small in her green school backpack, being pulled toward the vehicle's rear door by a man who had her by the sleeve of her jacket. Lila was not going quietly. She was pulling back, dragging her feet, her free hand pushing against the man's arm. Three other men stood positioned outward, watching the entry points. The fifth stood at the vehicle's driver's side, engine running. They were organized. They were calm. This was not improvised. And between them and the exit ramp stood Adrian Cole. He had his jacket off. She didn't notice when that had happened. I was standing in a low, wide stance 20 feet from the SUV, and something in his entire posture had changed. Not tense, not rigid, but different from every way she had ever seen him stand in 4 months of watching him in a rearview mirror. He was talking. She couldn't hear the words at first. His voice was low and steady, not raised. One of the men, the one built broadest, standing between Adrian and the vehicle, took a step forward. Adrian moved first. It was not the movement of a parking garage altercation. It was not the flailing, charging, desperate kind of fight that happens between ordinary people who are frightened. It was precise in a way that her brain could not immediately categorize. A controlled step inside the man's reach, one short strike, a pivot, and the man was on the concrete. The second came from the left. Adrian was already turning. She saw him take a hit to his right shoulder, saw him stagger, absorb it. And then his left arm came around and the second man went down hard. The third one ran. The fourth hesitated exactly 1 second too long. He didn't run in time. Lila broke free. The man who had been holding her sleeve had released his grip. He was backing toward the SUV now, all pretense of calm gone, and Lila stumbled forward 3 steps on the slick concrete floor and then just stopped, like her legs had decided they were done. Adrian reached her in 4 strides. He crouched down in front of her, and Evelyn saw it then, the way his right shoulder moved wrong, the way he held it, and said something quiet to her daughter. Lila looked up at him. Then she grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands and buried her face against his shoulder. The SUV reversed hard and screamed up the exit ramp. Somewhere above them, tires shrieked. Evelyn crossed the garage in something between a walk and a run because her legs still weren't working properly. The 2 men on the floor weren't moving. She could hear sirens already, distant but getting closer. She reached her daughter and dropped to her knees on the cold concrete and put her arms around her, and Lila made a sound, a single, shaking sob, and then went very still. Adrian stepped back. He had his jacket in his left hand, and he lowered himself slowly to sit on the concrete floor nearby. Not dramatically, not collapsing, just carefully, like a man managing pain he wasn't going to mention. Evelyn looked at him over Lila's head. He didn't say anything. He draped his jacket around Lila's shoulders from behind, the soft interior flannel facing inward against the chill, without asking permission and without making a production of it. Then he sat back and waited for the police. The 2 men he had incapacitated were arrested at the scene. A third was picked up attempting to exit through the street-level stairwell. The driver of the SUV was stopped 3 blocks away when a patrol car, already responding to a separate call, spotted the vehicle running a light. The 5th man, the one who had initially fled on foot, was not immediately found. Detective Marcus Hale arrived 40 minutes after the first units and spent 20 minutes talking to Adrian in a corner of the garage while paramedics looked at his shoulder and Evelyn sat with Lila on a folding chair someone had brought down from the security office. Lila still had Adrian's jacket around her shoulders. She hadn't let go of it. Evelyn watched Adrian across the garage, watched the way he answered Hale's questions, not quickly, not nervously, but with the specific patience of someone who had been debriefed before and understood the process. He pointed at things, described positions, gestured toward the ramp, toward the floor, toward the entry point he had come through. At some point, one of the officers said something to Hale, and Hale turned and looked at Adrian differently. Evelyn found out why 20 minutes later when Hale walked over to her. "Your driver," he said. "Former driver," she said automatically. Hale looked at her for a moment in a way she didn't fully like. "He's former Navy SEAL, 8 years of service, 2 overseas deployments, decorated. He separated from service several years ago after a family death." She stared at him. "His daughter," Hale said, and something in his voice was deliberate. "He left to raise her alone." Evelyn didn't say anything. "He walked into that garage because he heard your daughter's voice," Hale continued. "I was already on his way out of the building. He had his things. He was leaving." He paused. "He went back." She looked across the garage. Adrian was sitting against the wall now, his jacket gone, his right shoulder wrapped in a temporary brace from the paramedic's kit. He was looking at the floor, not at her. Not at anyone. Just present. Still. The way he always was. She had watched him through the back seat of a car for 4 months and thought she understood what she was seeing. She hadn't seen anything. Ms. Marlowe, Hale said carefully, the people who put this together knew your daughter's schedule. They knew which entrance she'd use. They knew when the building's rotation would have a gap. He waited a beat. This wasn't random. Somebody gave them that information. The garage suddenly felt colder than it had a moment ago. Lila was still holding Adrian's jacket, both hands curled in the dark flannel, her face finally starting to settle. Evelyn looked at the jacket, then back at the man sitting against the wall. She had fired him 11 minutes before her daughter was taken. She had fired him, and he had gone back anyway. Detective Hale gave Evelyn exactly 48 hours before he stopped being polite about it. She understood his position. A coordinated kidnapping attempt on a child, the daughter of a high-profile CEO, executed inside a secured building in broad daylight, was not something the department could afford to handle slowly. There were reporters already. 2 news vans had parked outside the Harlan building within an hour of the incident, which meant someone had a scanner or a contact or both. And the story would break whether Evelyn cooperated with the timeline or not. She cooperated. What she could not do was make Lila stop waking up at 2 in the morning. The first night after the garage, her daughter appeared in her bedroom doorway at 1:47 a.m., barefoot on the hardwood, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. She didn't cry. She didn't ask to get into bed. She just stood there until Evelyn pulled back the covers, and then she climbed in and lay very still with her back against her mother's side and stared at the ceiling. "Are they going to try again?" Lila asked. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "No." "How do you know?" "Because the police have them." "Not all of them." She was right about that. The 5th man, the one who had fled on foot, was still unaccounted for. Evelyn hadn't told her daughter this. She didn't know and couldn't figure out how an 8-year-old had arrived at that specific detail. "You don't need to worry about that," Evelyn said. Lila didn't respond. She just lay there, her breathing eventually slowing, the rabbit held loosely against her chest. At some point, she fell back asleep. Evelyn did not. She lay in the dark and thought about what Hale had told her in the garage. Not the part about Adrian. She'd been turning that over in her mind for hours already. But the other part. The part about someone inside her company. They knew Lila's schedule. They knew the entrance. They knew the security rotation. That kind of knowledge didn't come from the outside. Adrian came back to the building the next morning. Evelyn had expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Reluctance, maybe. Some degree of hesitation. Instead, he arrived at 9, not in a driver's uniform, but in dark pants and a plain gray pullover, his right arm in a proper sling now, and he sat down across from her in the conference room adjacent to her office with the same expression he'd had for 4 months, attentive, unhurried, and completely impossible to read. She had asked him to come. She hadn't been entirely sure he would. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "It'll need surgery eventually. Right now it's manageable." "Eventually." "I'm deciding when." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the conference room windows, the city was gray and cold, low clouds pressing down over the buildings, the kind of November morning that felt like an overture to something worse. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want an honest answer." "All right." "Yesterday morning, in the garage." She kept her voice level. "You were leaving. You had your things. You were already walking out." She paused. "Why did you go back?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just taking the question seriously. "I heard a kid scared," he said finally. "I know what that sounds like." "That's it?" "That's it." She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He wasn't performing modesty or fishing for her to push further. That was simply the full answer, stated plainly, and he was done with it. She folded her hands on the table. "I owe you an apology," she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like a man who had not expected the sentence but was filing it carefully. "The route," she said, "yesterday morning. Yesterday? You made the right call and I fired you for it. That was wrong." She kept her eyes on his. "I'm telling you that directly because I think you deserve a direct conversation." He nodded slowly. "All right. That's all you're going to say, eh? What else should I say?" "Most people would accept the apology." "I accept it," he said. "I just didn't need the ceremony." She almost smiled. Almost. "I want you to come back," she said, "not as a driver, as a security advisor. Specifically, I need someone I can trust to work with Detective Hale on the investigation, to help me understand how this happened and make sure it doesn't happen again." She paused. "I know that's a different job. And I know you were leaving because you didn't want to be here anymore." "I wasn't leaving because of the job," he said. "The job was fine." "Then why?" He looked at her for a moment, then, "I have a daughter. She's 6. I made a choice a few years ago to do work that didn't follow me home." He said it without apology, without any particular weight, just as information. "A driver's job doesn't follow you home. What you're describing might." "It might," she agreed. She didn't try to argue against it. "What would it take for you to say yes?" He thought about that. She noticed he didn't do it performatively, didn't lean back, didn't steeple his fingers, didn't make a show of deliberating. He just sat there and actually thought. "Sophie comes first," he said. "If she's sick, I leave. If there's something at her school, I leave. If I need to be somewhere for her, I go and I don't apologize for it. Done. I mean it, not done until the next emergency, and then it becomes a negotiable." "I understand what I'm agreeing to," Evelyn said. "I have a daughter of my own, Adrian. I know what that condition means." He looked at her differently then. Not more warmly, but differently. Like she had said something that landed in a place he hadn't expected it to. "All right," he said. "Then yes." He spent the first full day with Hale going through footage. The Harlan building had 17 cameras across its common areas and garage levels, and Adrian went through the recordings with the detective and a building security analyst named Torres in a room on the second floor that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. Torres had worked building security for 11 years. He knew the camera angles, the blind spots, the timing of each rotation. He also, Adrian noticed by mid-afternoon, knew where all the gaps were. He didn't say anything about it yet. He just noted it. What the footage showed was this. In the 6 days prior to the incident, a gray maintenance van had made 3 visits to the building. Each visit was logged, each one legitimate on paper. HVAC inspection, elevator calibration, fire suppression check, and each one had been authorized through the building's vendor access system by someone with internal credentials. The van's driver had never gone near the HVAC units, the elevators, or the fire suppression panels. He had, however, spent time on the garage's second sublevel on each visit, standing near certain columns, looking at certain entry points. He was mapping the space, Adrian said. Hale looked at the freeze-framed image on the screen. The man's face was angled slightly away from the nearest camera. On purpose. He knew where the cameras were, Adrian said. Look at the path he takes. He never gives a clean angle. Torres leaned forward. That's not something a random guy would know. No, Adrian said. It's not. He let that sit for a moment. Then he asked Torres to pull the internal access logs for the vendor authorization system. Specifically, which employee credentials had approved the 3 maintenance visits. Torres looked at Hale. Hale looked at Adrian. Then Hale nodded. It took Torres 40 minutes to pull and cross-reference the authorizations. All 3 had been approved using the access credentials of a woman named Janelle Pruitt, a mid-level administrative assistant in the building's security coordination office. Is she here today? Adrian asked. She called in sick this morning, Torres said. He said it quietly, and the 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Hale made a call. By end of day, 2 detectives were at Janelle Pruitt's apartment. She was home. She was by all accounts not sick in any conventional sense. She was sitting on her couch fully dressed, her phone on the cushion beside her, apparently waiting for something she had hoped wouldn't arrive. She asked for a lawyer before they finished the first sentence. Evelyn got the update from Hale at 7 that evening. She was in her home office by then, Lila asleep upstairs with the hallway light left on, a habit they'd abandoned 2 years ago that had quietly returned the night before. She sat with the news for a while. Janelle Pruitt had worked in the building for 3 years. Evelyn didn't know her face. She knew the title, Security Coordination, 3rd floor, but she could not have picked this woman out of a room, could not have told you the color of her hair or whether she took the elevator or the stairs. Someone had gotten to her, paid her, threatened her, or both. Hale didn't have the full picture yet, but the thread was there now, and it ran somewhere. The question was where. Evelyn opened her laptop and pulled up the file she'd been building since that afternoon. A quiet, private accounting of the people who had known Lila's schedule change that morning. Diana, her assistant. The school's administrative office. Marcos, the driver who had called in sick. Building management. And one more name she kept coming back to, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate yet, but that felt like the beginning of something she didn't want to be right about. Graham Mercer. He was her senior vice president of operations, 51 years old, 12 years with the company, the kind of executive who arrived early and left late, and whose name appeared on every major internal document, as a matter of course. I was the person who had, incidentally, recommended Adrian Cole for the driver position in the first place, 8 months ago, through a staffing agency he had used before. She didn't know what that meant yet. She told herself it might not mean anything, but she pulled his access records anyway, quietly. Through the internal HR system she had administrative rights to, and she noted which building systems he had logged into in the past 30 days. Then she closed the laptop and went to check on Lila. Adrian, at that same hour, was sitting at his kitchen table eating leftover pasta that he'd made 3 days ago and reheated in a pan because the microwave had been broken for 2 weeks, and he kept forgetting to replace it. Across the table, Sophie was drawing. She was deeply involved in whatever she was making, her tongue pressed slightly against her bottom lip in concentration, her markers lined up along the edge of the table in the specific order she always arranged them, dark to light from left to right. She was 6, and she had opinions about organization. "Daddy," she said without looking up. "Yeah. Is your arm broken?" He looked at the sling. "No, it's just a muscle problem." "Does it hurt?" "A little." She considered this. "I hurt my knee last week. At the park. Did I tell you?" "You told me." "It still has a scab." "I know. I can see it from here." She looked up at him then, and her expression was the expression she'd had since she was an infant, direct and serious and somehow already knowing, in the way that certain kids were just born looking slightly older than they were. She had her mother's eyes. He could still see that without flinching most days. Today was a most days kind of day. "Did something happen at work?" she asked. He looked at her, 6 years old. "Kind of," he said. "Is it bad?" "It was. It's better now." She seemed to weigh this. Then she went back to drawing. "Okay," she said. He watched her for a moment. Her hand moved carefully across the paper, choosing between a dark green and a lighter one, holding them up side by side in the kitchen light. He had left a lot for this. He knew other people didn't fully understand that. Not the people he'd served with, not the handful of old friends who still checked in occasionally, not even his sister, who lived 4 states away and called on birthdays and sometimes in between. They all thought his choice to step back had been about grief, about losing Diane, about a man unable to face the life they'd planned together once she was gone. That was part of it. He wouldn't lie about that. But the larger part, the part that got him out of bed at 5:30 every morning to make lunches and check homework and sit across from a 6-year-old asking pointed questions over pasta, was simpler. Sophie was here. He was here. That was the whole of it. He thought about Evelyn Marlowe's daughter, the way Lila's hands had gripped his shirt, the sound her breathing made when she finally felt safe, ragged at first, then gradually, slowly, evening out. He thought about the 5 men in the garage and the black SUV with its engine running. He thought about Janelle Pruitt sitting on her couch, waiting. Somebody had put this together carefully. Somebody had taken the time to map the building, track the schedule, find the access point, and place a person inside the system. That was not a crime of opportunity. That was a project. And projects like that had a budget, which meant they had a backer, which meant somewhere upstream of Janelle Pruitt, there was a person with enough money and enough motive to decide that an 8-year-old girl was an acceptable piece on the board. That thought did not sit well in his stomach, and it had nothing to do with the reheated pasta. "Daddy," Sophie said. "Yeah." "Look." She held up the drawing. It was a house. A big square house with a red roof and 4 windows, and a door with a round knob and 2 trees on either side. Exactly the kind of house that every child drew at 6, the universal template of what home was supposed to look like. In front of the house, she had drawn 2 stick figures, one tall, one small. The small one had a marker line indicating a ponytail. "That's us," she said. I can see that. I gave you both arms, she said. I have both arms. I know, but one of them is hurt, so I made them both the same in the drawing so it looks fair. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the drawing. Thanks, Soph. She set it on the table and went back to the next one. You can put it on the fridge, she said generously. He got up, his sling making the simple act of pulling the magnet off the fridge a minor operation, and he put her drawing up in the center, slightly crooked, between a grocery list and a soccer schedule. Set. Hale called the next morning at 7:40. Adrian was dropping Sophie at school, and he took the call, standing on the sidewalk outside the building, watching through the glass doors until she disappeared around the corner toward her classroom. Pruitt talked, Hale said. How much? Enough. She was approached 4 months ago. Cash payments wired through 2 different accounts. She was told she was providing access for a routine corporate intelligence operation. Her words. That someone needed to observe building operations for a competitive analysis. And she believed that. She says she believed it. I think she believed it enough to take the money and not ask too many questions. Hale paused. The payments trace back through a chain of accounts. Forensic accounting is working it, but we've got a shell company, registered to a holding entity. What's the holding entity? Hale was quiet for a beat. We're still pulling that thread, but it connects to a man named Damien Voss. Adrian hadn't heard the name. He stored it and said so. He's a private equity player, Hale said. Operates mostly in acquisition and restructuring. He and Marlowe Equity have been competing over the same target company for the better part of a year. It's a significant deal. Mid-sized logistics firm. Undervalued. Multiple parties interested. Whoever closes it first gains a substantial market position. Adrian thought about the garage, about the SUV and the 5 organized men, and the way they had stood positioned outward, watching entry points. That's what this was about, he said. A business deal? Leverage, Hale said. If they'd gotten the girl, they'd have used her to force Evelyn Marlowe into either withdrawing from the acquisition or selling a controlling interest under duress. It's not a new play. Ugly, but not new. What do you know about Smart, patient, uses intermediaries well enough that his name almost never appears on anything directly. This shell company connection is the closest we've gotten. Another pause. Adrian, there's something else. He waited. Pruitt says she wasn't the only inside contact. She was the building-level piece. Someone else was feeding schedule and access information from inside Marlowe Equity itself. Higher up. The wind came off the street and Adrian turned his back to it. She give a name? No, she either doesn't know it or she's holding it. But she confirmed the information was too specific to come from her level. She only knew the building logistics. Someone else knew the family schedule. Adrian thought about the thing Evelyn had asked him. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. And the way she'd looked at the laptop on her desk the previous afternoon, the file she'd had open that she'd quietly turned face down when he walked past the doorway. She already suspected someone, he thought. She just didn't want to be right about it yet. I'll talk to her this morning, he said. Do that, Hale said. And Adrian? Yeah. The man who ran, the 5th one. We found him. Alive? Yes. Picked up last night in a parking structure 4 miles from the building. He lawyered up immediately. A brief pause. But he had a phone on him. And the phone had messages. And the messages are going to take us somewhere. We just don't know where yet. Hale's voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man who'd been doing this long enough not to get ahead of the evidence. What I'm telling you is, we've got one thread coming out of the building and one coming out of Voss's network. And they meet somewhere in the middle. We just haven't found the middle yet. But it's there. It's there, Hale agreed. It didn't walk into that garage by itself. Evelyn was already at her desk when Adrian arrived at 8:15. She looked like she'd slept about as well as he'd expected, which was to say not much, but she'd covered it efficiently. The composed exterior that was, he was beginning to understand, both her professional armor and her biggest liability. She was so good at looking unaffected that people stopped checking if she actually was. He sat across from her and told her what Hale had said. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the desk in front of her, very still. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Inside Marlowe Equity, she said. That's what Pruitt indicated. She looked at the window. The gray November sky was doing the same thing it had done yesterday, just slightly colder. I've been pulling access logs, she said. Informally, on my own. She glanced at him. I didn't want to say anything until I was more certain. What did you find? I'm not certain yet, but there's a pattern. She looked back at the window. Graham Mercer, my SVP of operations. Over the last 30 days, he's accessed HR files, building security calendars, and Lila's school pickup schedule, which exists in our system because Diana updated the standing driver instructions 3 months ago. Adrian kept his face still. That's a lot of systems for an operations executive. He has broad access. The role requires it. She paused. But he also took 3 lunches in the last month at a restaurant in the Fenwick district. I know this because he submitted the receipts. Same restaurant each time. I looked it up. She finally turned and looked directly at Adrian. It's a 15-minute drive from his office for an average lunch. He submitted 90 minutes each time. 45 minutes unaccounted for 3 times over. Who else knows you're pulling these records? Adrian asked. Nobody. Keep it that way. He thought for a moment. Don't confront him. Don't change anything about how you interact with him. If he suspects he's being looked at, he'll have time to move things. I know that, she said. There was a slight edge in it. Not hostility, but the faint friction of a person who didn't like being told things she already understood. I know you know, he said. I'm saying it because I want us to be working from the same page, not because I think you need it explained. She looked at him. The edge didn't disappear entirely, but it softened. All right, she said. Hale needs what you found. The access logs, the receipt pattern, all of it. I'll send it this afternoon. He nodded. Then he said, How's Lila? Evelyn's expression changed in a way that was very small and very visible. It was the thing that happened when a question got past the professional surface before she could redirect it. She's with my sister today, she said. She slept, eventually. She asked this morning if the man who helped her was going to be around. What did you tell her? I told her yes. She paused. Was that accurate? It was accurate, he said. She nodded once. Then she went back to her screen, and he went down the hall to the room where Torres and the footage were waiting, and the morning continued the way mornings did. Not cleanly, not neatly, but forward, the way things had to go when there was still too much left undone. He spent the rest of the day in that room, going through footage frame by frame. I was looking for the second thread, the connection between whatever was happening inside Marlowe Equity and whatever Damien Voss had set in motion from the outside. It was there somewhere. He could feel the shape of it the way you felt a room's dimensions in the dark, without being able to see the walls. He would find it. He just needed to keep his shoulder from locking up long enough to do the work, keep Sophie's pickup scheduled for 5:30 with their neighbor Ruth, and not make the mistake of letting Evelyn Marlowe's composure convince him that she was handling this as well as she looked, because she wasn't. He could see that too. Most people couldn't. But Adrian Cole had spent 8 years reading environments that wanted to kill him, and he had learned a long time ago that the most important things were almost never the things that announced themselves. They were the quiet ones, the ones sitting still. The ones that looked like they had everything under control, those were the ones that needed watching. The footage from the third sublevel camera, Channel 9, captured 22 seconds that Torres had logged as a routine maintenance pass and flagged for nothing. Adrian watched it 4 times before he said anything. The timestamp read 11 days before the garage incident. The man on screen was the same one from the vendor visits. Same angle avoidance, same deliberate path through the frame. But this time he paused near the column at the southeast corner of level 3 for 6 seconds. He appeared to be consulting a phone. Then he put the phone away and moved on. What he'd been looking at on that phone was the question. Can we pull the cell tower data for this level? This time? Adrian asked Torres. Torres looked uncertain. That's a warrant. Hale can get it. He called Hale and relayed it. Hale said he'd have something by the following morning. Adrian spent the remaining afternoon going through the other channels, 12 more hours of footage, working backward in 2-hour blocks. And he found 2 additional moments that had been logged as nothing. A man leaning against a wall near the east stairwell door, apparently on a phone call, who turned out to be in the frame for exactly 4 minutes and 19 seconds without appearing to go anywhere or do anything. And a gray sedan, different from the maintenance van, that had idled in the visitor section of sublevel 2 for 31 minutes one afternoon before departing without logging a building entry. These things had been seen and recorded and then ignored because individually they looked like nothing. Together they looked like preparation. He wrote it up in a plain document. No formatting, just sequential observations, and sent it to Hale at 6:40 that evening from the parking lot of Sophie's school while he waited for her aftercare pickup. She came out at 6:52 in her coat with her backpack sitting wrong on her shoulders, one strap dangling, talking to another girl he didn't recognize. She stopped talking when she saw him and walked over. "Ruth usually gets me," she said. "I know. I finished early." Sophie looked at him with the same measuring expression she'd been deploying since she learned to focus her eyes. "Your arm is still in the thing. It's called a sling. Does it hurt less?" "A little less." She accepted this and climbed into the back seat, and on the drive home she told him, in the detailed and non-linear way that 6-year-olds narrated their days, about a disagreement at lunch over whose turn it was to be line leader, a science project involving bean sprouts, and a girl named Cassidy, who had cried because she forgot her show-and-tell item, and the teacher had let her bring a drawing she'd done during free time instead. "That was nice of the teacher," Adrian said. "Yeah," Sophie said. "Cassidy was really crying, like really crying. That happens sometimes." "I know." A pause. "I brought her one of my crackers at snack time." "That was good of you." She said, "Thank you." Another pause. "She has a really nice pencil case." He glanced in the rear-view mirror. Sophie had her face turned toward the window, watching the streets go by with the same dark eyes that saw everything and gave nothing away until she decided to give it. She was so much herself already. It still caught him, sometimes, how complete she already was. Hale had the cell tower data by 9 the following morning, and it gave them something. The phone that had been active near that southeast column during the 11-day prior footage had connected to 2 numbers in the 30 minutes surrounding the timestamp. The first was a burner, inactive now, already dead. The second was a number registered to a corporate account belonging to a logistics consulting firm based in the warehouse district. The logistics firm's registered agent was a man named Carl Dayton. Carl Dayton's professional history, when Torres ran it through the business registry database, showed 15 years of mid-level corporate consulting with a specialization in operations restructuring, and one notable current client engagement, listed on the firm's public profile as an ongoing advisory contract. The client was Voss Capital Group. "There it is," Adrian said. Hale, reading the same document across the table, said nothing for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath through his nose. "Dayton's a cutout. He's how Voss moves things without touching them." "Can you get to Dayton?" "We can talk to him. Whether he talks back depends on how well Voss has insulated him." Hale closed the folder. "But this is enough to open the formal investigation on Voss, which means we can start pulling his financial network legally." "That takes time." "It takes time," Hale agreed. He looked at Adrian. "What I need from you right now is the inside piece. Pruitt was the building access. The fifth man's phone gave us Dayton, which gives us Voss. But the schedule information, Lila's pickup change, the security rotation gap, that came from inside Marlowe Equity. Pruitt confirmed it. That person is still in place." "I know who it probably is," Adrian said. Hale waited. "I need one more day to be sure," Adrian said. "Evelyn found a pattern in the access logs. If I'm right about what it means, you'll have enough to bring him in cleanly." "Him," Hale noted. "Don't read too much into the pronoun yet." Hale looked at him for a moment. "One more day. What's?" Evelyn had pulled everything she could access without triggering an alert in the system. She'd been careful about it, going in through the administrative credentials she'd set up for herself 3 years ago during a board audit, the ones that logged as standard executive review rather than security investigation. She wasn't sure it made a difference. If Graham Mercer was watching the system, he might see it regardless. But she had to know. The access logs told one story. Graham had been into the HR calendar system 4 times in the past month, each time pulling records that included scheduled external events for executives, a category that, when Evelyn had first designed the system, she had included Lila's school schedule under, because Lila's schedule affected Evelyn's availability, and Evelyn's availability affected the whole company. She had built that system herself. She knew exactly what was in it. Graham didn't work with Lila's schedule. He had no reason to pull those records. She sat with that for a long time. 12 years. Graham had been with the company 12 years. He had been there when they were still operating out of a leased office on the 6th floor of a building they shared with a dental practice. He had helped her negotiate their first major fund close. He had worked 18-hour days during the restructuring in year 4 when they'd come within 3 weeks of running out of capital. She had trusted him. Not in the simple sense of trusting someone not to steal from you, something more than that. She had trusted that she knew who he was, that her judgment of him was correct. That belief had been, she was beginning to understand, a kind of arrogance she had been too comfortable with for too long. She was still at her desk when Adrian appeared in the doorway at 4:15. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Tell me what you found," she said. He came in, closed the door, and sat across from her. He walked her through the cell tower data, the Dayton connection, the link to Voss Capital. He did it in the same way he did everything, without unnecessary motion, without performing urgency, just one piece set down after another until the shape of it was visible. When he was done, she was quiet. "And inside the company," she said, "I need to show you something." He turned his laptop around. On the screen was a side-by-side comparison, the timestamps from Graham's system access logs on the left, and on the right, a timeline of events reconstructed from the investigation, when the vendor visits happened, when the maintenance van appeared in the garage footage, when the security rotation gaps had been created. Every one of Graham's accesses corresponded to a window preceding each event by 48 to 72 hours. He wasn't gathering intelligence at random, Adrian said. He was feeding a schedule. Each time the operation needed to update their information, he went into the system. Evelyn's face did not change. This was the professional exterior she had built over a decade, and it held. But her right hand, which had been resting on the desk, moved to her lap. "The restaurant lunches," she said. "Dayton's office is 11 minutes from that restaurant," Adrian said. She closed her eyes for one moment. One. Then she opened them. "He recommended you for the driver position," she said. Her voice was very even. "I know." "Did Voss's people approach him before or after he placed you?" "That's a good question," Adrian said. "And the honest answer is, I don't know yet. It might matter for the criminal case. It doesn't change what happened." "It matters to me," she said. He looked at her. "I know that too." She stood up and walked to the window. The city below was doing its late afternoon thing. The shift change in the streets, the density of people increasing as offices emptied, the particular quality of light in November that was less golden than copper, a reluctant warmth already heading somewhere else. "When I was 26, she said, I had a partner before the company, business partner, not—" She stopped, started again. "We built a small fund together for 18 months. He was the one who brought in the first investors. I thought we were equal partners." She paused. "He was taking a percentage off the top and routing it through his personal account the entire time. I didn't find out until the fund was almost shut down by the investors." Adrian said nothing. "I swore after that," she said, "that I would never be fooled by someone close to me again, that I would read people well enough that it couldn't happen." She was quiet for a moment. "Instead, I got better at performing that confidence." "Most people do," Adrian said, "after something like that. I thought I was being rigorous. I was just being arrogant about it." She turned from the window. "How do we do this?" "Hale will handle the arrest. He needs your access log documentation. Everything you pulled, tonight if possible. I'll compile it now. Don't tell anyone else in the company. Not Diana, not anyone on the floor. Mercer can't know this is coming." "I understand." She sat back down. "What about Voss?" "Hale's opening the formal investigation. The Dayton connection gives them the thread. It'll take time to pull it all the way back to him, but it'll get there." She nodded. Then, "This isn't over yet, is it?" It wasn't a question, not quite. "No," he said, "not yet." She looked at him steadily. "What aren't you telling me?" He held her gaze. One of the things he had noticed about Evelyn Marlowe over the past days was that she asked the right questions. She didn't always ask them in time, and she didn't always want the answers, but she asked them. "Hale thinks the operation may have had a contingency," he said. "If the garage attempt failed, there may have been a second phase built in." The silence between them had weight. "A second team," she said. "It's a possibility Hale is taking seriously. The fifth man's phone had communications that suggest the garage was considered the primary attempt, not the only one." Evelyn was still for a moment. "Where is Lila now?" "Your sister's apartment." "That location. How many people know it?" "You, your sister, Diana." He paused. "And anyone Diana may have mentioned it to, even casually." She reached for her phone. "Don't call Diana yet," he said. "Mercer may be monitoring communications from the office. If he gets any indication, then what do I do?" "I'll call Hale right now. We get surveillance on your sister's building tonight, quietly." He was already reaching for his own phone. "And we move Lila again before morning." Graham Mercer was arrested at 7:18 the following morning. Hale's team waited until he was inside the Harlan building lobby, badge already swiped, the elevator doors about to close. And then two detectives stepped in with him, and the doors closed, and the elevator went to the second floor, instead of the 14th where Graham's office was. And by the time he understood what was happening, there were 4 officers in the corridor, and his options had narrowed considerably. He asked for a lawyer before they reached the interview room. But he didn't ask quickly enough to stop one detective from noting his expression when they told him they had his access logs, his restaurant receipts, and a phone recovered from Carl Dayton's office the previous evening containing 17 text messages over a 6-week period. The expression was not surprise. It was calculation, the look of a man rapidly assessing how much they had against how much he could afford to give up. Torres called Adrian with the confirmation at 7:45. Adrian was sitting in the parking lot of Sophie's school waiting for the doors to open, a half-eaten granola bar on the dashboard and his coffee going cold in the cup holder. "Clean?" he said. "Clean," Torres said. "No incident." He let out a breath. "Hale wants you at the precinct at 9 if you can make it." "I'll be there." He watched through the windshield as the school's front doors opened and the first cluster of kids moved up the sidewalk, backpacks bouncing, voices carrying in the cold air. Sophie's classroom was on the second floor, east wing. He knew the building well enough by now that he could navigate it in the dark, which he nearly had once when the winter concert ran long and the corridor lights were on a timer. He got out and walked her in. She was in a mood that morning, not bad, not good, just internal, whatever occupied the private interior of a 6-year-old that didn't always have a name. And she let him fix her dangling strap at the door without complaint, which meant she was less interested in demonstrating independence than usual. "You're picking me up today?" she asked. "Ruth's getting you. I have work." "Okay." She looked at him. "Is the arm better?" "Getting there." She patted his forearm with 2 fingers, gently, with a precision that suggested she was being careful, and then turned and went inside. He stood at the door and watched until she turned the corner. The interrogation of Graham Mercer took most of the morning. Adrian sat in the observation room with Hale's partner, a detective named Reyes, and watched through the glass. Mercer was composed in the way of a man who had rehearsed composure for a situation like this at some level of his mind, for long enough that it had become a kind of muscle memory. He didn't rage. He didn't plead. He didn't make the mistake of pretending he didn't know what they were talking about. What he did, for the first 40 minutes, was say nothing of substance while his lawyer, a composed woman in a gray suit who had clearly dealt with this room before, listened and occasionally conferred with him in a whisper. Then Hale set the Dayton phone transcripts on the table. The first message in the chain, 6 weeks before the garage incident, read, "Schedule confirmed. Access window is valid. Proceed with site assessment." The second, 4 days later, rotation updated. East entrance viable. Recommend morning window, Tuesday or Wednesday. There were 15 more like it. Mercer looked at the transcripts. He looked at his lawyer. She said something to him. He looked back at Hale. "My client," his lawyer said carefully, "would like to discuss the parameters of a cooperation agreement." Hale's expression didn't change. "We're listening." What Graham Mercer gave them, across 3 hours, and with the careful architecture of a man protecting himself as efficiently as possible, was this. Voss Capital had approached him 14 months ago. Not Damien Voss directly, never directly. That was the whole structure of how Voss operated. But through an intermediary who came with a proposal that had been packaged, Graham said, as a business opportunity. Voss wanted inside access to Marlowe Equity's acquisition strategy for the logistics firm. Not to steal it, to anticipate it. To know Evelyn's timeline and countermove before she could close. In exchange, Mercer would receive a finder's fee, structured as a consulting payment through a separate LLC that over the 14 months had totaled just under $230,000. That was the first arrangement. The second had come 8 months ago, when Voss's strategy had shifted and the intermediary had returned with a different kind of request. By then, Graham was in deep enough that saying no would have required him to expose what he'd already done. The second arrangement was the one that involved Lila. He claimed, sitting across from Hale with his hands flat on the table and his voice carefully modulated, that he hadn't known it would go that far. He had provided schedule information, access data. He had opened certain internal records. He had not, he said, understood that the endpoint of all that information was a child in a parking garage. Reyes, watching through the glass beside Adrian, said quietly, "Do you believe that?" Adrian looked at Mercer through the one-way window, the composed face, the careful hands. "No," he said. "Neither does Hale," Reyes said. The cooperation agreement would let the prosecutors build toward Voss more efficiently, which was the calculation. Mercer took a lesser charge to give them the bigger one. It wasn't justice in the clean sense. It was the way these things worked, and Adrian had enough experience with the space between clean and real to know that you took what you could build with. He called Evelyn from the corridor at 12:30. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting. "He cooperated," Adrian said. "Partial. Enough." There was silence on her end. 14 months, she said finally. "Yes." Another pause. "He was there when we celebrated the company's 10th anniversary. He gave a toast." Adrian didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. "Right," she said. Her voice had gone back to the even register, but it was the kind of even that took effort. "What does this mean for Voss?" "It means Hale can move faster. The financial forensics have been running since yesterday. The Dayton connection, combined with what Mercer gave them, should be enough to freeze Voss's assets pending the full investigation." "And the second phase," she said. "You told me there might be a second team." "That's still the concern," he said. "The fifth man's phone had communications that referenced a contingency if the primary failed. We don't know if it's been activated or abandoned." "Abandoned seems optimistic given everything," Evelyn said. "It does. Lila's been moved to my sister's place in Whitmore. That's 20 miles out, different county." "I know. Hale has surveillance there." "How good is the surveillance?" "Good enough," he said. Then, because she deserved more than that. 2 unmarked units on the street, one in the building's management office, with access to the camera system. "If anything moves toward that address, we'll know." She was quiet again. He heard her exhale. "Adrian," she said. "Yeah." "If Voss still has people active—" She stopped, started again. "What's your honest assessment of the risk level right now?" He thought about it. He could give her the version that was reassuring, and it would be partially true, or he could give her the version that was accurate. "Elevated," he said. "Mercer's arrest will get back to Voss. Not through official channels, his lawyers. And once Voss knows Mercer cooperated, he needs to make a calculation about whether to cut his losses or accelerate." "Accelerate," she said. "If he accelerates, the contingency gets activated, which means we have a window, probably 48 to 72 hours, where the risk is highest. And after that?" "After that, Hale's investigation becomes visible enough that it's too costly for Voss to continue. The exposure becomes greater than any leverage he could gain." He paused. "We need to get through the next 3 days cleanly." "I'll go to Whitmore tonight," she said. "Be with Lila." "That might actually help," he said. 2 targets in the same location simplifies the surveillance footprint. "That's not why I'm going." "I know," he said, "but it's also true." He drove to Whitmore that evening himself, not because Hale had asked him to, but because there was a difference between knowing surveillance was in place and seeing the location with his own eyes, understanding the angles and the approach routes and the particular geography of a building he hadn't been inside. His shoulder ached for the entire drive. The sling came off inside the car because it restricted his ability to check his mirrors properly, and he'd started doing that, removing it when he drove, over Evelyn's very specific objection 3 days ago. He hadn't argued, he just kept doing it. The building in Whitmore was a 6-story residential on a tree-lined street, the kind of neighborhood that was quiet in the specific way that meant people knew their neighbors and paid attention to things that were out of place. That was useful. It also meant anything unusual would be noted by residents, which cut both ways. He drove the surrounding blocks twice before parking. He sat for a moment and looked at the building. The unmarked unit Hale had placed was in the parking structure across the street, elevated, clear sightline to the main entrance and the service entrance on the east side. A second unit was somewhere on the street. He didn't try to identify it. The surveillance wasn't his operation to manage. What he was doing, he admitted to himself as he sat in the cooling car, was something less professional. He was making sure. The way you made sure about things when the professional assessment was sound, but some part of your mind needed the physical confirmation, the actual building, the actual angles, the actual distance between the entrance and the elevator and the sixth floor where Evelyn's sister lived. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, forwarded through Hale's office. Cell tower data from fifth man's phone 48 hours prior to garage. One of the numbers called resolves to a residential address in Whitmore, Kellner District. He looked at the text. Then he looked at the building. Kellner District was the neighborhood he was sitting in. He called Hale in 14 seconds. "I'm looking at the building," he said, before Hale could speak. "I just saw it too," Hale said. "We don't know yet if it's connected to the same operation or coincidental. The tower data covers a broad radius. The Kellner District is—" "It's not coincidental," Adrian said. "Hale, it's not." A pause. "I'm adding 2 more units. It'll take 20 minutes. I'm not waiting 20 minutes. Adrian, I'll stay outside. I'm not going in unless something moves." He looked at the building entrance. "But I'm not driving away." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Your shoulder. It works." "That's not the same as—" "I know what it's not the same as," Adrian said. "Add the units, Marcus. I'll stay on the line." He set the phone on the dashboard, kept Hale on speaker, and settled back in the driver's seat with his eyes on the entrance to the building. The street was quiet. A couple walking a dog crossed the far end of the block. A light came on in a third-floor window. The 2 trees flanking the main entrance moved slightly in a wind he couldn't feel inside the car. His shoulder had a deep, bone-adjacent ache that he had learned to identify over years as the kind that meant the joint was working on something structural, something that wasn't going to respond to ice or ibuprofen, something that wanted to be addressed by someone with surgical tools and several months of rehabilitation waiting on the other side. He thought about Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator. Both arms the same. Made them equal so it looks fair. He thought about Lila in the garage with her hands curled in his shirt. He thought about the 5 organized men and the black SUV and the way the operation had been put together. The patience of it, the months of preparation, the multiple layers, the contingency planning. Whoever had designed this wasn't improvising. They had built something that was meant to survive a failure at the primary level. He thought about Evelyn upstairs in her sister's apartment, sitting with her daughter, trying to make it feel like a visit and not a hiding. The street was still quiet. His phone screen showed Hale still on the line, the timer ticking. 12 minutes had passed since the text. He was watching the service entrance on the east side. The one the surveillance unit across the street had a partial but not complete sightline, too, when a gray panel van turned onto the block. It drove slowly. Not suspiciously slowly, just the pace of a vehicle in a residential neighborhood where the posted limit was 25. But Adrian had watched a lot of vehicles in a lot of contexts, and there was a category of slow that was navigational and a category that was observational, and this van was in the second category. It stopped at the far end of the block. Engine still running. "Hale," he said. "I see it," Hale said. One of the surveillance units had radioed in simultaneously. "We're moving." "How far out?" 9 minutes. The van sat for 30 seconds. Then it moved. Not away, not forward, but into the alley that ran along the east side of the building, the side with the service entrance, the side with the partial blind spot. Adrian was out of the car before he'd made a conscious decision to be. His shoulder sent a spike of complaint that he noted and set aside. He moved along the far sidewalk, using the parked cars as a sightline break, and reached the alley entrance in time to see the van stopped 30 feet in, its rear doors opening. 2 men. Both moving with the same deliberate quiet as the men in the garage 11 days ago. The kind of quiet that wasn't about stealth. It was about training, about the difference between trying to be silent and simply being accustomed to operating without noise. One of them had a maintenance order in his hand. Adrian assessed the alley in the 2 seconds he had. Van blocking egress, service door 20 feet ahead, one light fixture overhead that wasn't working, trash receptacle against the wall to his left, chain link section at the far end. He stepped into the alley. "Hey," he said. Both men turned. He had their attention for exactly 1 second before they processed what they were looking at. A man in dark clothing who had appeared from the wrong direction at the wrong time. The one with the maintenance order moved first. Adrian had fought with his shoulder in this condition once before, years ago, under circumstances he didn't revisit often. He knew what he could do with it and what he couldn't. He couldn't absorb impact on the right side. He couldn't extend the arm fully or put it into a block without the joint sliding in a way that ended the engagement immediately. What he could do was everything with the left, and use his right as a convincing enough presence that the other man didn't know it wasn't fully functional. The first man came in fast and overconfident, which was the thing that undid people who had trained but hadn't failed enough. Adrian stepped inside his reach, used his left forearm to redirect, put him into the chain link at the far end of the alley with enough force that the fence sang against its frame. The second man was more careful. He came in lower, slower, reading the situation better. And Adrian registered that as the more dangerous one. They moved for about 8 seconds in the narrow alley before Adrian took a hit to his right shoulder that came from a direction he hadn't protected properly. The joint slid. It wasn't a dislocation. It was something adjacent to one, a partial failure of everything that was already compromised in there. And the pain was the kind that arrived not as a sharp thing, but as a total systemic event, bright and encompassing and sudden. His right arm stopped responding to intention. He adjusted. Left hand, the wall, one knee. He reoriented and came back in lower because you couldn't stop moving when stopping meant losing. He'd learned that at 23 in a place he didn't name in casual conversation, and he got his left arm around the second man's neck from behind and held on until the man stopped struggling. He held it 3 seconds longer than necessary. Then he let go. Both men were on the ground. His shoulder was making a sound inside itself that was not a sound it was supposed to make. I was standing in an alley in Whitmore at 8:43 p.m., with his right arm hanging in a way that he was going to have to deal with the implications of, and the first police unit turned into the alley with its headlights cutting the dark before he had time to think about sitting down. Hale arrived 4 minutes later. He stood at the alley entrance and looked at the two men on the ground, and then at Adrian standing against the wall with his right arm held carefully against his side. "You said you'd stay outside," Hale said. "They went inside the perimeter," Adrian said. "You don't have a perimeter." "I do now." Hale looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to the officers and started directing the containment, and Adrian leaned a little more of his weight against the wall and breathed carefully and let the adrenaline process itself through his system the way it did when there was nothing left to spend it on. His phone buzzed. Evelyn. He looked at the screen for a moment, then he answered. "We heard sirens," she said immediately. "What happened?" "What happened, Adrian?" "There was a secondary team," he said. "Hale's people have them." A silence. He could hear her breathing. "Are you—" She stopped. "I'm okay," he said. It was mostly true. "Lila's okay?" "They didn't reach the building. It's clear." Another silence. Longer this time. "Your shoulder," she said. He looked at his arm. "I'm going to need to make a call about the surgery sooner than I was planning." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "It's manageable," he said. "Adrian." Her voice had dropped below the professional register entirely. It was just her, at that pitch. The one underneath all the competence and the control and the armor she'd built and maintained through a decade of being the only person in every room who couldn't afford to flinch. "Thank you." He leaned his head back against the brick wall. The alley smelled like damp concrete and the particular coldness of November nights in the city, and above the buildings the sky was a dark gray that wasn't quite black, the ambient light of the city pressing upward against the clouds. "Go be with your daughter," he said. He ended the call and stayed there against the wall while Hale's team worked the scene around him, and eventually a paramedic appeared with a portable brace, and he let her strap his arm into it without argument, which was more than he'd done last time, and probably progress of some kind. Damien Voss still had not been arrested, but his second team was in handcuffs on the pavement of a residential alley, and that thread was about to pull everything else behind it, and Adrian Cole stood in the cold with his arm in a brace and his shoulder making its structural complaints, and waited to find out if the worst of this was actually over or only appearing to be. He had learned, over the years, not to trust the appearance of things being over, but he had also learned that sometimes, not always, not cleanly, but sometimes, they actually were. He was not sure yet which kind of night this was. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday. Adrian had wanted to push it to the following week. There were still open threads in the investigation. Hale was in the middle of the financial forensics on Voss's network, And the idea of being under general anesthesia, while any of that remained unresolved, sat poorly with him. His orthopedic surgeon, a direct woman named Dr. Felice Ramos, who had spent 12 years repairing the shoulders of professional athletes and did not traffic in patience when it came to patients who delayed necessary procedures, told him that pushing it further would risk permanent structural compromise to the rotator cuff, and that she had blocked out 2 hours of her Thursday for him specifically. He went in on Thursday. The surgery took 2 hours and 20 minutes. When he came out of anesthesia in the recovery room, the first thing he was aware of was a nurse adjusting something on the IV line and the specific cotton-muffled quality of the world that came with whatever they'd given him. And the second thing he was aware of was Sophie sitting in the chair beside the bed, still in her school clothes, a library book open in her lap that she was not reading. She was watching him. "Hey," he said. His voice came out wrong, too low, slightly scraped. "Hi," she said. "How'd you get here?" "Ruth brought me." She glanced toward the door. "She's in the waiting area. She said she'd stay until you were awake." "I'm awake." "You were making a weird noise before." "What kind of noise?" Sophie considered. "Like when the heat comes on in the apartment, that clunking thing." He almost laughed. "That's not great." The nurse said it was normal. She looked at the book in her lap, then back at him. "Does it hurt?" "Not right now. It will later." "More than before?" "Different than before. The before hurt was from using it wrong. This kind will be from fixing it." She absorbed this with the particular seriousness she brought to information she was storing. "So the fixing hurts more than the breaking?" He looked at her. "Sometimes, yeah." She nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she had already suspected about how the world worked. Then she went back to the book, or the pretense of the book, and he closed his eyes and let the cotton-muffled world do what it needed to do. He was a 63-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived 2 floors below them and had been Sophie's backup caregiver for 3 years, with the kind of uncomplicated reliability that Adrian had learned not to take for granted. She patted his arm, told him he looked like he'd been through something, and said she'd take Sophie home and make dinner and he should not worry about anything tonight. He thanked her in a way that probably didn't fully convey what he meant. She seemed to understand anyway. So, Evelyn came to the hospital that evening. He hadn't asked her to. He hadn't expected her to. He was sitting up in the adjustable bed, eating something that had been described on the menu as chicken soup, but was performing the role unconvincingly, and the door opened and she came in still wearing her work clothes, dark blazer, hair pulled back, carrying a paper bag from a restaurant he didn't recognize. She set the bag on the bedside table. "The hospital food here is genuinely terrible," she said. "Diana told me which floor you were on." He looked at the bag. "You didn't have to do this." "I know that." She sat down in the chair Sophie had occupied earlier, setting her bag on the floor, and for a moment she just looked at him with the same direct assessment she brought to every situation, except that it was stripped of the corporate register right now, just a person in a chair looking at another person in a bed. "How bad is it?" 6 to 8 weeks in the sling, physical therapy after. Full recovery is probably 4 months. "And you'll actually do the physical therapy?" "I'll do the physical therapy." She seemed to find this mildly doubtful, based on her expression, but she didn't push it. "Hale called me this afternoon," she said. "The 2 men from the Whitmore Alley, they're cooperating, partially." "How partial?" "Enough to confirm the contingency was activated when they learned about Mercer's arrest. Voss gave the order through Dayton." She paused. "And Dayton is talking." Adrian set down the hospital spoon. "About Voss directly?" "About the instruction chain. It goes Voss to Dayton to a coordinator whose name I don't know yet, and then outward." She crossed her legs, her posture, the habitual composed posture that he suspected she maintained even when she was alone. "Hale says the federal investigators are involved now. The financial forensics revealed accounts in 3 countries. This is bigger than one acquisition." "It always was," he said. "The acquisition was the immediate motive, but a network like this doesn't get built for one deal." "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." She looked at the window. The hospital room window faced east toward a grid of city lights that went as far as the horizon and then blurred into the sky. He watched her look at it. 12 years, she said. It was not the first time she'd said it, but the weight of it seemed to have shifted since the last time. Not lighter, but more settled, like something she was learning to carry rather than something that was still knocking her down. Did Mercer explain why? Adrian asked. His reason? Money, at first. That's what he told the prosecutors. She looked back from the window. And then fear of what would happen if he stopped. That's what he told himself, probably. A pause. I've been thinking about whether there's a version of this where I could have seen it coming. What did you decide? That I probably couldn't have. Not the specific thing, but... She stopped. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she looked at them for a moment. I created conditions where loyalty was rewarded with proximity and access became a kind of currency, and people who accumulated that currency started making calculations about its value that I wasn't aware of. She looked up. That's a structural problem. I built it, even if I didn't intend it. He thought about that. Most organizations have it. Most organizations don't have a senior vice president feeding a kidnapper their 8-year-old school schedule, she said. Fair. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the paper bag and produced a container, and the smell that came out of it when she peeled the lid was significantly better than the chicken soup situation he'd been dealing with. What is that? He asked. Beef stew. Real one. From the place on Addison that's been there since 1987. It reheats in the microwave. She set a plastic spoon beside it. The nurse said you could have real food. He pulled the container toward him. You called ahead to check. I called Diana, who called the floor nurse. There's a difference. Is there? She gave him a look that was approximately 3 degrees warmer than her professional look, but still deployed with precision. Eat the stew, Adrian. He ate the stew. It was in fact substantially better than the chicken soup. They sat in the quiet of the hospital room for a while, with the particular ease of people who had been through enough together in a short time that silence didn't require management. Outside, the city made its night sounds, distant, muffled by the glass, present enough to be company. How's Lila? He asked. She asked about you today, Evelyn said. When I told her you had surgery, she wanted to know if it hurt. Sophie asked the same thing. What did you tell Sophie? That fixing hurts differently than breaking. Evelyn looked at him. That's actually a reasonable answer for a 6-year-old. She's a perceptive kid. So is Lila. A small pause. She still has your jacket. He'd forgotten about the jacket. Or not forgotten. He'd been aware it was gone and hadn't gone looking for it, which wasn't the same as forgetting. She can keep it, he said. I told her you might say that. She said she already decided she was keeping it regardless. Evelyn's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. She said she'd ask you officially when you weren't in a hospital. She can still ask. The answer will be the same? The answer will be yes. She nodded. Then she picked up her bag from the floor and stood, settling her blazer, which was the habitual closing gesture of a woman preparing to leave a room. She did it automatically, he'd noticed, a kind of professional self-assembly that happened without conscious direction. I'll let you sleep, she said. Evelyn. She stopped. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to say. He found, which was not usual for him, that there were several things operating at different levels, and he hadn't sorted out which ones were worth the words. What you said about structural problems, he said finally. The conditions you created. Yes. You already know what needs to change. You've known for a few days. She looked at him. You think I'm being too hard on myself? I think you're being accurate, he said. I'm not suggesting you stop. I'm saying you know what it is and you know how to fix it, and that's more than most people get after something like this. He paused. That's worth something. She was quiet for a moment. You're not good at accepting help, she said, but you're actually quite good at giving it. He thought about arguing with the first part, decided not to. Drive safe, he said. She left. He finished the stew and then lay in the adjustable bed listening to the ambient hospital sounds. The PA system, the footsteps in the corridor, the periodic beep of something monitoring something, and thought about the specific shape of the situation, where it had started and where it was now. Damien Voss had not been arrested yet. That was the remaining piece, and it had weight. The arrest happened on a Monday, 9 days after the surgery. Adrian was at home, arm in the new post-surgical sling, going through physical therapy exercises that Dr. Ramos had sent in a PDF with annotations indicating which ones were non-negotiable and which ones had more flexibility, when Hale called at 10:14 a.m. "We have him," Hale said. Adrian set the printed PDF on the kitchen table. "Where?" "His offices." He didn't run, which is either confidence or stupidity. A pause that carried a specific quality. Probably both. "Federal?" "Joint, FBI and the DA's office. We're listed as assisting." Hale's voice had the quality it had when he was managing satisfaction, keeping it professional while it leaked slightly through the professional. The charges include conspiracy, wire fraud, attempted extortion, and 2 counts of criminal facilitation related to the kidnapping attempts. The financial forensics found accounts across 3 jurisdictions. He's looking at significant federal exposure. Dayton? Already processed. He's cooperating fully. The closer the investigators got to his role, the more willing he became to discuss Voss's. Another pause. Mercer's cooperation agreement is formalized. He'll do time, but considerably less than Voss is looking at. Adrian looked out the kitchen window. The late November morning was clear for the first time in a week. The sky, the specific pale blue that happened after a cold front, had scrubbed through and left everything sharp-edged and momentarily honest. "Is it solid?" he asked. "The case." The financial piece alone would hold him. The phone records, the Dayton chain, Mercer's testimony, it's layered. His lawyers are already talking about the complexity of a long trial as a strategy, which means they know they can't beat the substance, Hale said. "It's solid." Adrian let out a breath he hadn't been entirely aware of holding. "Good," he said. "Yeah," Hale said. Then, "Adrian, you should know. The DA's office mentioned your name in the preliminary filing. The alley intervention in Whitmore is part of the evidentiary narrative. Your actions that night are documented." "I know. There may be questions about the specifics of the engagement." "I know that too." A brief pause. "You want to talk to their office before it goes further? I can set up a—" "Send me the contact and I'll reach out this week," Adrian said. "I'm not worried about it." "All right." Hale's tone settled into something easier. "Buy me coffee sometime." "I'll buy you coffee." "Not the hospital vending machine garbage." "Real coffee," Adrian said. "Good. Take care of the shoulder." He ended the call and sat with the news for a minute in the quiet kitchen. Sophie's drawing was still on the refrigerator, slightly more crooked now because he'd knocked it adjusting a magnet last week and hadn't straightened it. The grocery list beneath it had evolved through 3 versions: items added, crossed off, added again, in the ongoing low-level negotiation between what the household needed and what he actually remembered to buy. He thought about Damien Voss in the clinical way he thought about all threats once they had been contained, with the specific relief that came not from resolution exactly, but from the reduction of probability. The situation was not fully over. Trials took time. Evidence would be challenged. Lawyers would work their strategies. But Voss was in custody. His network was exposed. His financial instruments were frozen, and the operational capacity that had organized the garage attempt and the Whitmore contingency was dismantled. Lila was safe. That was the operative fact, and it had been the operative fact since the alley, but it was different now. It had the weight of something that was going to stay true rather than something that required constant defending. He picked up his phone and sent Evelyn a text. Hale called. "They have Voss. Case is solid." 3 minutes passed. Her reply came as a single line. "I know. Hale called me too. Are you at home?" He wrote back, "Yes." Another minute. Then, "I'm coming over. Lila wants to give your jacket back properly. I told her you said she could keep it. She said she knows, but she wants to ask you herself." He looked at the message for a moment. Then he looked at the apartment, the state of it, which was the state of a home occupied by a man who had been managing a 6-year-old, a compromised shoulder, and an active investigation simultaneously. It was not a disaster. It was not presentable. It was the intermediate territory of functional chaos. He texted back, "Give me 40 minutes. Up." He cleaned the kitchen and the living room in 35, which involved some creative decision-making about where things went on a temporary basis. He could not do much about the physical therapy equipment Dr. Ramos had arranged to be delivered, a resistance band system and a portable shoulder pulley that took up one corner of the living room in a way that was more medical than welcoming. He pushed it slightly toward the wall, which helped marginally. Sophie was at school. Ruth was doing the pickup. He made coffee because it seemed like the right gesture, and then stood in the kitchen wondering if making coffee was too presumptuous, and then decided that analysis was ridiculous and left the coffee. They arrived at 11:40. Evelyn was in a coat he hadn't seen before, dark green, longer than her usual ones. Lila was in her school uniform and her regular jacket, which meant she'd been pulled from school for this, and she had her backpack on one shoulder and Adrian's jacket folded over both her arms, held carefully the way you held something you were returning because you'd decided the right thing was to return it, even though you didn't want to. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "You look different," she said. "Surgery," he said. She thought about this. "Does the surgery change how you look?" "It changed how I'm standing. My shoulder's in a different position." She examined this conclusion seriously. Then she held out the jacket with both arms. "I wanted to give it back, because it's yours." He crouched down, carefully, his right arm held steady, and looked at her. "I told your mom you could keep it." "I know, she told me." Lila kept the jacket extended. "But it was yours first, and you might need it." "I have other jackets. But this is the one that—" She stopped. Something moved across her face that was too old for 8. "This is the one from that day." He looked at her. The jacket was a plain dark canvas field jacket. Nothing distinctive, the kind of thing you bought at a surplus store without particular thought, worn enough to be soft. Nothing remarkable about it except what it had been wrapped around and when. "Yeah," he said. "It is." "I was really scared," Lila said. It came out simply, without drama, the way children sometimes said the truest things, as bare statement. "I know," he said. "You talked to me." She was still holding the jacket out, but her eyes were on him. "Before the police got there, you sat down with me and you talked to me and you didn't." She paused. "You didn't act like it was a big deal, even though it was." "Panicking doesn't help," he said. "And you were already scared enough for both of us." She looked at him for another moment, then, "Were you scared?" "A little," he said, which was true. Not in the way she meant, not for himself, but for her. For the 8 seconds between when she broke free and when he reached her, those 8 seconds had a texture he wasn't going to describe to an 8-year-old. But not for very long. She nodded slowly. Then she pushed the jacket the final few inches toward him. He took it. She immediately looked like she regretted it. He saw that. The small shift in her face, the recalibration. And he held the jacket for a moment and then held it back out to her. "Actually," he said, "I think I want you to have it." She looked at the jacket in his hand. "You just took it back." "I know. I changed my mind." "You can't change your mind." "I can," he said. "It's my jacket." A brief battle with herself was visible on her face. Then she took it. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone accepting a logical outcome they hadn't fully engineered. He straightened up. Evelyn was standing just inside the door, watching this with an expression that had set aside all of its professional characteristics and was simply a mother's face, which was a different thing entirely. "Coffee?" he said. "Please," she said. "Oh." They sat at the kitchen table, Evelyn and Adrian, while Lila, who had been given permission to look at whatever was in the living room, discovered the pulley system and asked several technical questions about how it worked that he answered as accurately as he could for an 8-year-old. "Can I try it?" she asked. "It's for shoulders," he said. You'd need a shoulder problem." "What if I pretend to have a shoulder problem?" That would undermine the medical purpose. She considered this as a real constraint rather than a no, which he appreciated. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "She's been sleeping better," she said, low enough that it was for him. "The last 3 nights, since Voss was arrested." "Kids pick up on the ambient state," he said. "When the adults around them relax, they relax." "I haven't relaxed." "You've relaxed more than you were." She looked at him. "Is that observable?" "Yes." She didn't seem to know what to do with that, so she drank her coffee. Through the kitchen doorway, the sound of Lila carefully investigating the resistance band system was audible, the quiet of someone trying to be respectful of other people's things, which was a quality that came, he suspected, from how she'd been raised. "I've been restructuring the company," Evelyn said. "The access systems, the compartmentalization of sensitive information. Diana is taking on a different kind of role, more coordination, less exposure to everything. I'm bringing in an external security audit firm next month." "Those are good moves." "There's also a personnel review, people who had broad access and no clear need for it." She paused. I've been thinking about how I promoted people, what I rewarded. What did you reward? She turned the mug slightly on the table. Availability, dedication in the visible sense, the long hours, the always-on quality. The people who were conspicuously present. She stopped. I overlooked people who were quietly competent, people who didn't announce what they were doing. He didn't say anything. There's a woman on my operations team, she said. Natalie. She's been there 6 years. Her work consistently outperforms her peers by every measurable metric, and I have never once stopped in the hallway to acknowledge it because she doesn't ask for acknowledgement. She looked at the table. I knew her name because it appeared on good reports. I didn't know anything else about her. Are you telling me that or telling yourself? She glanced up. Both. Then it's useful either way. She was quiet for a moment. From the living room. Adrian, this band is really strong. I can barely pull it. It's rated for medical rehabilitation, he called back. Your arms are fine. My arms are pretty strong, actually. I'm sure they are. A brief pause. I'm going to try anyway. Evelyn's mouth moved. It was the real version. Not the professional near smile, but an actual one, arriving without management, there and gone in a few seconds. He noticed it. He'd been noticing things like that for a week without examining the noticing too closely, because there was a category of awareness that was useful to acknowledge, and a category that was more productive to leave alone while the situation was still in motion. The situation was less in motion now. He was aware of that too. I wanted to say something to you, Evelyn said. The slight change in her voice indicated that what was coming had been prepared. I've been thinking about how to say it, and I keep arriving at the same words, so I'm just going to use them. All right, he said. She looked at him directly. What I said to you that Tuesday morning, the way I dismissed you. I gave you a speech about protocol and independence, and I fired you because you made a decision I hadn't authorized. And I was so certain I was right that I didn't spend 30 seconds considering whether you might have had a reason. She held his gaze. I've been thinking about how many other times I've done that. To other people, about other things. And the answer is more than I'd like. Evelyn, I'm not asking you to tell me it was fine. It wasn't fine. She said it without self-flagellation, just plainly. I am good at some things. Reading situations quickly, making structural decisions, building systems. I am not good, or I was not good, at accounting for what I don't know about the person in front of me. A brief pause. I knew nothing about you, 4 months, and I thought I knew enough. He thought about what to say. He could tell her the firing didn't matter because what had happened after made it irrelevant, which was partially true. He could tell her that he didn't hold it against her, which was also true, and would have been easier for both of them. Instead, he said, You're harder on yourself than you are on other people. She blinked, slightly. You catch your own errors and examine them in a way you probably don't apply to the people around you, he said. That's useful because you actually change based on it. But it also means you're carrying more weight than you need to. He paused. You don't owe me a continued reckoning. You apologized. I accepted it. We've done enough since then that the morning of the firing it's not gone, but it doesn't have the same shape anymore. She looked at him for a moment. You're very direct, she said. Is that a problem? No, she said. No, it's not a problem. From the living room came a sound of moderate effort, and then, I pulled it! I pulled the band! Great, Adrian called. How many should I do? None. It's calibrated for my shoulder. Oh. A pause. Can I do one more? Evelyn pressed her lips together. One more, he called, a satisfied sound from the other room. He refilled both their coffees from the pot on the counter, managing the pour with his left hand in a way that had become, over the past week, less awkward than it had initially been. The right arm was in the sling properly today, immobilized at the angle Dr. Ramos specified, and it ached in the specific post-surgical way that was different from the operational ache he'd been managing for months, deeper, more insistent, more honest about what had been wrong in there. I want to talk about what happens next, Evelyn said when he sat back down. With your role, what you want it to look like going forward. I thought we already established that. We established the condition, Sophie first. We didn't establish the rest. She held her mug. I want to be specific. I don't want there to be a version of this where the job evolves into something that violates the spirit of what we agreed to without technically violating the letter. He looked at her. You think that would happen? I think I'm capable of it without intending it, she said. I expand what I need from people gradually, and I don't always notice I'm doing it until someone's working twice the scope they originally signed on for. A pause. I'm telling you this so you can push back when it starts happening. I'll push back. I need you to actually do it, not once, and then accommodate. Evelyn, he said, I'm going to push back. She looked at him with something that landed between assessment and the beginning of trust. The real kind. The kind that came after enough evidence rather than before it. All right, she said. The consulting scope should be defined in writing, he said. Physical security assessment, advisory on protocols, incident response planning, fixed hours with a defined escalation structure for emergency situations. Sophie's schedule is a hard constraint, not a preference. Diana needs to know it and honor it. I'll have legal draft it this week. And one more thing, he said. She waited. I'm not going to be in the building every day. Some of this work is better done from the outside looking in. I need that distance to see what's actually happening with your security posture versus what you think is happening. He paused. That means there will be times you want me present and I won't be there. I understand. Do you? She met his eyes. I'm working on it. That was, he thought, a better answer than yes. Lila appeared in the kitchen doorway at 20 minutes past noon, having apparently exhausted the entertainment potential of the physical therapy equipment. She had the jacket over one arm. She looked at her mother and then at Adrian and then back at the table. Are you guys done talking? She asked. Close, Evelyn said. I'm hungry. I know, we'll go soon. Lila came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat down in the third chair, Sophie's chair, though she didn't know that, and put both arms on the table in the patient, anchored way of a child who had been waiting in rooms while adults finished their conversations for her entire life and had developed a systematic approach to it. Adrian, she said. Yeah. When you're better, she stopped, reformulated. After the sling is gone, will you be at my mom's office sometimes? Sometimes, yeah. She nodded, processing. My mom says you're going to help make things safer. That's the plan. Are you good at that? I think so. She considered. You were good at the other thing, the parking garage thing. She said it without drama, the way she'd been saying the true things all morning, just directly, as observation. So probably you're good at this too. Probably, he said. She seemed satisfied. Then she looked at the jacket over her arm. I'm going to keep this at school, she said. In my locker, so I know where it is. That makes sense, he said. If I leave it at home, I might forget it's special, she said. At school, I see it every day. He looked at her, at this 8-year-old in her school uniform with her backpack on one shoulder and an oversized canvas jacket folded over her arm, explaining the logic of her memory systems. And he thought that kids were, when you let them just be who they were without managing it, frequently more precise about what mattered than adults gave them credit for. Smart thinking, he said. She accepted this and slid off the chair. Mom, I'm actually really hungry. Evelyn stood and they moved through the familiar choreography of leaving, coat retrieved, bag over shoulder, a survey of the table to make sure nothing had been left. And Adrian walked them to the door. At the Evelyn stopped and turned. She didn't say anything for a moment, and it wasn't the hesitation of someone searching for words. It was the pause of someone deciding whether the words they had were the right ones for right now. Thursday, she said. Sophie, she likes pancakes, right? On weekends. He wasn't sure how she knew that. He thought he might have mentioned it at some point in some context. Every Saturday morning, he said. She nodded. Lila's been asking to have a friend over for weeks. I keep saying when things settle down. She paused. Things are settling down. He looked at her. We don't need to make it complicated, she said. Pancakes are pancakes. Pancakes are pancakes, he agreed. She turned and walked toward the elevator, Lila already pressing the button with the focus of a person who had been waiting to press it. At the elevator doors, Lila turned and gave him a brief, businesslike wave with the hand that wasn't holding the jacket. He lifted his left hand. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. The doors closed. He stood in the doorway of his apartment for a moment, in the quiet of the late morning, the clear November light coming through the hallway window, his shoulder in its sling, the residual smell of coffee still in the air behind him. He thought about Damien Voss sitting in federal custody. He thought about Graham Mercer's calculation in the moment he first accepted money from an intermediary he knew he shouldn't trust. He thought about Janelle Pruitt on her couch, waiting for something she couldn't stop. He thought about all the moments in which each of those choices had been made, the specific quiet of each one, the reasoning that had surrounded it, the way a person could arrive at a wrong thing incrementally and not see the accumulation until it was complete. And he thought about Evelyn Marlowe standing in a hospital room, handing him a container of beef stew and not pretending it was a routine visit, and Lila deciding that a jacket should live in a school locker so she'd see it every day and remember it was special, and Sophie at the kitchen table holding 2 markers up to the light to find the exact right shade of green. None of it was clean. None of it had resolved into the neat shape that stories were supposed to resolve into. Mercer would testify at a trial. Voss's lawyers would work their strategy. The company would have months of restructuring ahead of it, and some of those months would be difficult, and Evelyn would make new mistakes even as she corrected the old ones, because that was how it went. His shoulder would take 4 months, and he would probably push the physical therapy harder than Dr. Ramos recommended, and she would tell him directly to stop, and he would adjust and then push again. Sophie would grow up, and there would be things ahead of him in that particular endeavor that he could not see yet, and he would handle them with the same imperfect present-tense attention he'd brought to everything else. He stepped back inside and closed the door. In the kitchen, the coffee was still warm. He poured the last cup and stood by the window with it, looking out at the clear blue November morning, and let himself feel, not grateful exactly, not relieved exactly, but something in the neighborhood of both. The kind of feeling that didn't have a precise name because it was made of too many things at once. The hard part had passed. What came next was ordinary. And ordinary was, he had understood for a long time now, the whole point. The Pancake Saturday happened 3 weeks after Voss's arrest, on a morning in mid-December when the city had finally committed to winter, and the sidewalks were salted and the sky was the particular white that meant snow was considering its options. Adrian had been up since 6. Not because he needed to be. Sophie didn't wake until 7 on weekends, a consistency he had come to rely on the way you relied on structural features of a building, but because he slept differently now that the sling was off. The shoulder was still in rehabilitation, still subject to a daily set of exercises that required concentration and a tolerance for the specific discomfort of a joint relearning its range. But the sling was gone, and without it he woke up reaching for things in the night in ways he hadn't when the arm was immobilized, and sometimes the reach caught the shoulder wrong and he was up. He had made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below while the building was quiet around him, the kind of early morning quiet that felt inhabited rather than empty. All those lives stacked in their apartments above and below, asleep or almost. The particular rest of a Saturday when the week had finally released people. He thought about Diane sometimes, in the early morning, not with the sharp, destabilizing grief that had defined the first 2 years after her death, that had blunted itself into something he carried more like scar tissue now, present and sometimes tender, but no longer capable of stopping him where he stood. He thought about her the way you thought about someone who had been essential to who you were, and whose absence had reshaped you in ways you were still, years later, mapping. She would have had opinions about all of it, the job, Evelyn, the garage, the surgery. She had always had opinions, and she had delivered them without softening them, which was one of the reasons he had loved her, and also one of the reasons they had argued with a regularity that their friends found alarming and they had found necessary. She would have said something pointed about his shoulder, something about the difference between courage and stubbornness, which she had maintained were not the same thing and which he had maintained were more related than she acknowledged. They would have disagreed about this at the kitchen table over coffee, probably on a morning exactly like this one, and Sophie would have been in the other room drawing, and it would have been ordinary in the specific way he had not understood the value of until it was gone. He understood it now. That was the thing grief did. Eventually, if you let it, it moved from obscuring everything to clarifying certain things. It taught you, slowly and at some cost, what the ordinary was actually worth. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:12, her hair still pressed flat on one side from sleeping, wearing the sweatshirt she'd had since last winter, that was now slightly too short in the arms. "They're coming today," she said. "Good morning to you too." "Good morning." She climbed onto her chair. "What time?" 10. She looked at the clock on the microwave. That's a long time. It's 2 hours and 48 minutes. She absorbed this. Can we do the batter now so it's ready? If we do the batter now, it'll be ready at 7:15, and then we'll have nothing to do until 10. We could make practice pancakes. We're not making practice pancakes. What if they come out wrong on the real ones? They won't. But what if... Sophie. He poured her a glass of orange juice and set it in front of her. The pancakes will be fine. She wrapped both hands around the glass. I've never met them before. I know. What if we don't have anything to talk about? He looked at her. She was 6, and she was nervous, which was a version of her he didn't see often because she was typically the most comfortable person in any room she entered, a quality that had always seemed to come from somewhere intrinsic rather than anything he'd taught her. You'll find something, he said. What if Lila doesn't like drawing? Then you'll talk about something she does like. What does she like? Books, I think. The kind about animals. Sophie's expression shifted toward interest against her will. What kind of animals? I don't know specifically. You could ask her. She drank her juice and seemed to be running the scenario internally, testing possible conversational trajectories, the way she approached most things that mattered to her, with preparation and the mildly anxious thoroughness of a person who cared about outcomes. Dad, she said. Yeah. Is she nice? He thought about Lila in the alley's aftermath, explaining her locker logic with complete sincerity. He thought about her sitting across from him in his kitchen, asking if the fixing hurt more than the breaking. She's very direct, he said, like you. Sophie took this as the positive assessment it was intended to be. They arrived at 10:05, Evelyn in the dark green coat again, and Lila in a red jacket with her backpack, which she apparently brought everywhere as a matter of principle. Adrian let them in and took Evelyn's coat, and there was the minor chaos of entry. Where to put things, Sophie appearing from the hallway and stopping at a precise distance from Lila, the way children sometimes did when they were assessing each other before deciding on an approach. Lila looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at Lila. Hi, Lila said. Hi, Sophie said. A brief pause. Do you like drawing? Sophie asked. I like reading more, Lila said, but I draw sometimes. What do you draw? Animals, mostly. I'm not very good at it, though. I'm good at animals, Sophie said, with the simple factual confidence of someone stating a documented truth. I can show you. Okay, Lila said. And that was apparently sufficient, because Sophie turned and led Lila down the hallway toward her room, and within 90 seconds, there was the sound of 2 children's voices doing the rapid calibration thing that children did when they were figuring out who the other person was, which operated on a faster and more instinctive frequency than adults managed. Adrian looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the hallway. That was easier than I expected, she said. Kids are efficient, he said. He poured her coffee without asking because she'd said yes to it every time, and there was no reason to perform the question as ceremony. They sat at the kitchen table the same way they had 3 weeks ago, except that the post-surgical stiffness was less acute now, and the apartment looked more like itself and less like a man managing too many things at once. The physical therapy equipment was still in the corner, but it had been organized. The grocery list on the refrigerator was current. Sophie's drawing was still crooked on the fridge, but there were 2 more beside it now from the past week. A horse that was actually identifiably a horse, and what appeared to be a family of penguins engaged in some kind of organized activity. How's the shoulder? Evelyn asked. Better. Range is about 60%. Ramos says 90 by February if I stay consistent. Are you staying consistent? Mostly. She looked at him over her mug. What does mostly mean in this context? It means I do the exercises and occasionally make a judgment call about what counts as rest day. And Ramos disagrees with your judgment calls. Ramos disagrees with most things I do, medically speaking. We've developed a productive working relationship based on her being right and me acknowledging it on a slight delay. Evelyn's mouth moved in the way that had become, over these weeks, one of the things he noticed and didn't examine too closely. That real smile arriving without management, not performed for any particular purpose, just there. The trial date is set, she said, March. Voss's lawyers requested a delay, and the judge partially granted it, so it pushed from February. She turned the mug on the table. Hale thinks it'll go forward. The evidence is apparently substantial enough that even aggressive defense motions aren't creating significant structural risk to the prosecution. Mercer's testimony is the anchor, Adrian said. That and the financial records. Hale said the forensic accountants found a level of documentation that Voss apparently believed was buried well enough that it would never surface. She paused. I was wrong about that. People who operate through multiple layers of insulation start to confuse distance with invulnerability, Adrian said. They stop being careful because they've never been caught. Is that a general principle? It's what I've seen. She nodded. The logistics acquisition, the firm Voss and I were both pursuing. We closed it last week. He looked at her. Without the sabotage, without the pressure, with Voss's financial instruments frozen and his credibility in the industry effectively destroyed, she stopped. We closed it, at a reasonable valuation, on our timeline. A pause. Natalie ran the final due diligence. I gave her the lead. The woman from your operations team, he said. She was extraordinary. She caught 3 valuation discrepancies the original analysts had missed. She presented them to the board without any of the, Evelyn searched for the word, without any of the performance I was used to seeing in those presentations. Just the work, just the facts and the reasoning behind them. And the board responded to that? Some of them were confused by it, actually. They're used to a certain kind of presentation, but the substance was undeniable. She looked at her coffee. I promoted her to senior analyst last Monday, with a compensation adjustment that reflects what she was actually worth instead of what I'd been paying her. He didn't say anything. She cried, Evelyn said, in my office. Not dramatically. Her eyes went, and she apologized for it, which made me feel worse than I would have felt otherwise. She set the mug down. She said she'd been doing this work for 6 years and no one had ever told her it was exceptional. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That happens more than it should, Adrian said. I know, I was part of why it happened in that specific instance. She looked at him directly. I've been going through the team, not just operations, the whole company, asking people who they think is doing exceptional work that goes unrecognized. The answers have been consistent enough to be uncomfortable. What are you doing with the information? Acting on it, she said. Slowly, because wholesale restructuring of recognition culture isn't something you do in a month. But there are 23 people who are getting real conversations this quarter that they should have gotten 2 years ago. He thought about the people who did their work quietly, the ones who showed up and did it well and didn't announce it and were passed over not because they'd failed, but because they'd failed to make their competence visible in the ways the system rewarded. He had been one of those people for 4 months in the back seat of a car. He didn't say that. She already knew it. The security audit firm starts in January, she said. They'll spend 6 weeks going through the systems. I'd like you to be in the room for their findings. I'll be there. There's also... She stopped. Started differently. There's a position I've been thinking about. Not the consulting role we defined, something different. She looked at him carefully. Head of Corporate Security. A permanent position, internal. Overseeing all of it. Physical security, information security, access management, incident response. He looked at her. I know that's not what we discussed, she said. I'm not presenting it as a revision to the agreement without your input. I'm presenting it as an option, something to consider. That's a significant scope, he said. It's a significant role. It would change the work-life structure we built into the consulting contract. It would, she said, which is why Sophie's schedule protection would need to be built into the employment terms directly, with explicit rights, rather than relying on a goodwill interpretation. She paused. I had legal draft a framework. Not to pressure, just so the concept was concrete if you wanted to look at it. He thought about it. The honest version of the thought, not the quick one. The consulting role had been the right structure for where they were. Uncertain footing, new relationship, a situation still unresolved. It gave him distance and independence and the ability to leave if the thing they'd built turned out to be something other than what it looked like. But it had been 6 weeks now. And the thing they'd built looked like what it looked like. Send me the framework, he said. I'll read it. That's all I'm asking. Is it? She met his eyes. For now. From Sophie's room, the sound of a negotiation was audible, Specific, structured, with the back-and-forth rhythm of two children who had decided they were going to get along and were now working out the operational terms. Something about whose markers were whose, and a ruling on whether the penguin drawing Sophie was apparently recreating for Lila's benefit could be modified to include a different kind of bird if Lila preferred. "She's recreating the penguin drawing," Adrian said. Evelyn listened. "Lila has opinions about birds." "Strong ones?" "She went through a phase with flamingos." She tilted her head. "I think we may be entering a new phase." He refilled their coffees and they sat in the comfortable quiet that had become, without either of them engineering it, one of the defining qualities of being in the same room together. The quiet that didn't need management. That could hold a conversation or hold the absence of one without becoming uncomfortable in either direction. He thought, not for the first time, that this was a thing he hadn't expected to find again. Not the specific form of it. This was its own thing, not a repeat of something lost. But the quality. The particular ease of being with someone and not having to work at it. He had thought for a while that he might have used up his capacity for that kind of ease, that it was something you had a fixed amount of and He'd been wrong about that. He was glad to have been wrong. The pancakes happened at 11, because it turned out Lila and Sophie's negotiation had produced a collaborative drawing of what Lila described as a flamingo-penguin hybrid species, which Sophie found scientifically questionable but artistically interesting, and they had lost track of time. Adrian made the batter from the recipe he'd been using since Sophie was 4. Nothing complicated, the kind of recipe that worked because it was straightforward rather than because it was clever. And Sophie dragged a step stool to the counter to supervise, which mostly meant narrating the process to Lila, who was sitting at the kitchen table watching with the focused interest of someone encountering a new domestic ritual. "He always does the bubbles thing," Sophie told Lila. "What's the bubbles thing?" Lila asked. "When the bubbles on top of the pancake pop and don't fill back in, that's when you flip it." "How do you know when they don't fill back in?" "You watch," Sophie said, with the authority of someone who had watched this process approximately 300 times. Lila came and stood beside Sophie on the floor next to the stove, and they both watched the surface of the first pancake with the intensity of people monitoring something important. "There," Sophie said, pointing. "See how those aren't filling?" "Yeah," Lila said, leaning in. "Yeah, I see it." Adrian flipped the pancake. Both girls evaluated the underside as it landed. "Good color," Sophie announced. "It smells really good," Lila said. Evelyn was leaning against the counter with her coffee. Watching this with an expression Adrian glanced at once and then looked away from, because it was the kind of expression that deserved privacy. A mother watching her daughter be ordinary and safe and interested in the bubbles on a pancake in someone else's kitchen. The particular relief of that specific ordinary thing after the weeks they'd been through. He focused on the pancakes. They ate at the kitchen table, all 4 of them, with the maple syrup Sophie had strong opinions about. The real kind, she told Lila, not the fake kind, which was a distinction she had been clear about since she was 5, and Adrian had made the mistake of buying the wrong bottle. And the conversation moved in the organic, slightly chaotic way of meals with children, where the subject could shift from flamingo taxonomy to the best way to eat a pancake to a detailed account of a class play rehearsal without any transition logic connecting them. Lila, it turned out, had strong opinions about play rehearsals. "I was supposed to have a bigger part," she told the table, "but Jalen forgot his lines 3 times, and Mrs. Harmon decided to give everyone shorter parts so nobody had too much to remember." "Was that fair?" Sophie asked, with the moral precision of a 6-year-old who thought a lot about fairness. "No," Lila said, "but Mrs. Harmon said it was better for the group." "That's not the same as fair." "I know." Lila ate a piece of pancake. "But the show was better, so maybe it worked out." Sophie considered this. It visibly complicated her framework. "Sometimes the fair thing and the good thing are different," Adrian said. Both girls looked at him. "Which one is more important?" Sophie asked. "Depends on the situation," he said. Sophie frowned. "That's not a real answer." "It's the real answer. It's just not a simple one." She ate her pancake in the thoughtful silence of someone storing an unsatisfying but possibly true piece of information for later processing. Evelyn caught his eye across the table. Something moved between them in that glance. Not a dramatic thing, not a declaration of anything, just the recognition that passed between people who had been paying attention to each other for long enough that they could read the same moment and find the same thing in it. He looked back at his pancakes. She looked back at hers. The morning continued. Later, after the plates were cleared, after Sophie had shown Lila her full collection of drawings organized in a folder she kept under her bed, with a system only she fully understood, after Evelyn had helped him with the dishes because he'd made a move toward the sink and she'd simply appeared beside him with a dish towel without asking. Later, with the girls back in Sophie's room and the kitchen clean and the December afternoon light coming through the window at the flat angle of winter afternoons, they stood in the kitchen, in the quiet, and Evelyn said, "I'm glad you went back." He looked at her. "In the garage," she said. "When you heard Lila, I know you said it was because you heard a scared kid, and you know what that sounds like. I believe that's true." She held her coffee mug, though it was empty. "I'm still glad you went back." "You already thanked me," he said. "This is different from thanking you," she said. I'm telling you that it changed something for me, not just practically, something else." She looked at the mug in her hands. "I had been operating for a long time on the assumption that the way I read people was reliable, that my judgment of someone was close enough to accurate that I could act on it confidently." She paused. "You were in my car for 4 months. I watched you every day. I thought I knew what you were and weren't." And I knew nothing," she said simply. "And after the garage I started wondering, who else? Who else had I been looking at and not seeing? Who else had I decided I understood before I'd actually looked?" She set the empty mug on the counter. "That question has been uncomfortable. It's also been the most useful thing I've thought about in years." He thought about what it cost to ask that question. Not the asking of it, the living with the answer. The specific discomfort of a person who had built their professional identity on perceptiveness. Discovering that their perceptiveness had been, at some level, a performance they were giving themselves. "Most people don't ask it," he said. "Most people don't get fired for a bad judgment call and then have that judgment call proven catastrophically wrong within 14 minutes, she said. The feedback loop was unusually efficient. He almost smiled. "That's one way to put it. The other way to put it," she said, "is that I was lucky. That the person I dismissed was the kind of person he was." She looked at him directly. "A different person would have just left, would have had every right to just leave." He didn't argue with that. It was true. "Why didn't you?" she asked. Not the way she'd asked it in the conference room weeks ago. That had been a real question, newly formed, looking for information. This was different. This was a question she'd been turning over for long enough that she was asking it to hear what he'd say now, with more time behind both of them. He thought about the honest answer. "Because I heard a kid who was scared," he said. "That's still the first part, and it's still true," he paused. "But also, I spent 8 years doing a specific thing, making decisions in bad situations where waiting wasn't an option, and I walked away from that because I wanted a quieter life. A life where the decisions I made were about lunches and school pickups and whether to fix the microwave." He stopped. "I don't regret that choice. It was the right one, but there's a part of you that doesn't stop being what it trained to be. You just choose when to use it." She was quiet, listening. "That Tuesday morning," he said, "I could use it for something that mattered, for a kid who was scared." He shrugged with his left shoulder. "So I did." She was quiet for a moment after that. "Thank you for saying it plainly," she said. "You asked plainly." "I do that. I've noticed." The light in the kitchen had shifted to the late afternoon quality that happened fast in December, the pale afternoon becoming something dimmer and cooler, the city outside going into its early dark winter mode. From Sophie's room, a burst of laughter, both girls overlapping, and then the particular quiet that followed laughter, which was its own kind of warmth. Evelyn turned toward the sound. He watched her turn. There was something he had understood for a few weeks that he hadn't said, because the timing of saying things mattered, and the situation had still been too active, too unresolved, too much in motion. But the motion had slowed. The pieces had settled. Voss was in custody. Mercer's deal was formalized. Lila was safe. His shoulder was healing, and the pancake Saturday had happened and had been exactly what it looked like. He understood, too, that there was a difference between the right time and the perfect time, and that the perfect time was a fiction that careful people used to keep from saying things that needed saying. "Evelyn," he said. She turned back. "I want to take the internal position," he said. "I'll read the framework tonight, but I already know what I'm going to tell you." She looked at him steadily. "Okay." With the conditions in the contract, hard conditions, not preferences. Hard conditions, she agreed. And I want to be clear about something else, he said. He paused, not from hesitation, from the deliberateness of someone who had thought about how to say a thing accurately. This, he indicated the kitchen, the apartment, the sound of the girls in the other room, the coffee cups, and the pancake breakfast, and the two of them standing in the winter light. Whatever this is, it exists separately from the job. She held his gaze. I'm not saying it because I want something from you professionally, he said. And I'm not saying it because of the garage or what came after. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you've spent enough of your life having people say things to you that weren't fully true. She was very still. You can tell me you need time to think about it, he said. I don't need time to think about it, she said. He waited. She stopped. A small, genuine thing moved across her face. I'm not very good at this part. Professionally, I can walk into any room and say exactly what needs to be said. This is different. You're doing fine, he said. You can't possibly know that. I've been paying attention for a while now. She made a sound that was neither a laugh nor a sigh, but somewhere between both, and she looked at him with the expression that was neither professional nor performed, but simply hers, the actual woman under all that competence and control and armor, who had built a billion-dollar company and raised a daughter alone and survived a betrayal inside her own organization and was standing in a near stranger's kitchen in December trying to figure out how to say a simple thing. Okay, she said. Then, yes, to whatever this is. He nodded. She nodded. From Sophie's room, Dad, Lila drew a really good horse. Show me later, he called back. It's actually really good, Sophie said, with the earnest generosity of someone giving genuine credit. I'll see it later. The apartment settled back into its quiet. He drove Sophie home through the city that night. Evelyn had taken Lila in her own car, and there had been goodbyes at the door that involved Sophie and Lila exchanging what appeared to be their school email addresses on a piece of paper with a solemnity that suggested they understood this to be a formal arrangement. And Sophie was quiet for most of the drive, which was the quiet of a satisfied tiredness rather than a troubled one. At a red light, he looked in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at the city going past, the winter lights, the streets wet with the snowmelt from that afternoon's brief and not particularly committed snowfall. Dad, she said. Yeah. Lila said you saved her. He looked at the light. It was still red. I helped, he said. She said you came back when you didn't have to. I heard her, he said. I couldn't not go. Sophie thought about this. Is that what you did in the Navy? Go when you heard people? Something like that. But you stopped. I did. Because of me. The light went green. He moved through the intersection. Because I wanted to be here, he said. For mornings, for pancakes, for the regular stuff. But today you made pancakes and you also saved someone, she said, with the particular logical satisfaction of a child who had identified a flaw in a premise. That was a while ago now, Soph. But it still counts. He thought about what to say. About the version of this conversation that was accurate and the version that was simple, and whether there was a way to find the place where they overlapped. I think, he said, that sometimes you can be two things. You can be the person who does the quiet, ordinary stuff, and also be the person who goes back when you need to. One doesn't cancel out the other. She was quiet for a moment. Like how I can be the person who draws penguins and also the person who helped Cassidy with her crackers, she said. Exactly like that. She seemed to find this satisfying. He drove through the city with the heater running and Sophie going soft in the back seat, the way she did when she was tired and comfortable. The particular heavy-limbed relaxation of a 6-year-old at the end of a good day. The streets were wet and the lights ran in long reflections across the pavement, and the city was doing its winter night thing, drawing inward, warming itself, going on. He thought about the mornings that would come, the physical therapy and the ongoing work and the legal framework he'd read tonight, and the trial in March, and all the ordinary and less ordinary days that would accumulate between now and wherever this was all going. He thought about Evelyn in her kitchen doing the work of becoming a different kind of leader. Not abandoning what she was. She was too much herself for that, and too good at too many things, but adding to it. The willingness to ask who else she'd been looking at without seeing. The specific courage of that question, which looked quiet from the outside and was not. He thought about Lila keeping a jacket in her locker so she'd see it every day and remember it was special. An 8-year-old system for honoring something that mattered, built from the practical materials available to her. He thought about Sophie telling him both things could be true: penguins and crackers, ordinary and necessary, present and capable. He had spent a few years believing these were in opposition, that choosing the quiet life meant the other part of him had to go dormant, be stored, stop being relevant. He had made that bargain consciously, and he had not regretted it, but somewhere in it he had accepted a false choice, as if the man who showed up for school pickups and fixed breakfasts and navigated Tuesday mornings was a different person from the man who heard a frightened child's voice and went back. They were the same person. They had always been. Sophie was asleep by the time he pulled into the parking structure below their building. He carried her up, carefully, his right arm still not fully load-bearing but managing, and she half woke in the elevator and walked the last stretch to her room under her own power, trailing one hand along the wall, her eyes not fully open. He got her into bed without drama, which was the best-case version of this operation. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. She was already fully asleep. On her nightstand, turned face down, because she always turned it face down when she slept, a habit with an origin he'd never successfully identified, was the illustrated book she was currently working through, something about a girl who could understand what animals were saying. She'd been reading it for 2 weeks and had opinions about every chapter. He turned off the light. In the kitchen, he poured a glass of water and stood at the window with it. The legal framework from Evelyn's office was in his email, and he'd read it tonight, and his answer was already formed. Not because he'd rushed it, because some answers arrived complete before you'd consciously assembled them, built from everything that had accumulated in the weeks prior. He thought about the specific morning, the Tuesday in November, 8:47 a.m., that had started all of it, being fired, walking out, hearing a child's voice. He thought about how thin the margin was, how a different route, a different morning, a different driver who didn't hear or heard and kept walking, how easily this whole thing could have gone differently. How many moments in any life turned on something that small? That thought had a way of making people either fatalistic or grateful, depending on who they were. He was, mostly, grateful. Not for the kidnapping or the surgeries or the months of accumulated danger, but for what had been visible on the other side of it, what you could see more clearly when the emergency was over and the people you'd helped were safe and the ordinary morning was still waiting for you. You could see clearly what you'd actually been protecting all along. It wasn't just Sophie. Though Sophie was the center of it, it was the whole architecture of the small life. The drawings on the refrigerator, the coffee going cold because you forgot it, the negotiations over markers and the overcomplicated feelings about which maple syrup was correct, and the school emails exchanged with the seriousness of a diplomatic treaty. It was pancakes on Saturday. It was the fact that next Saturday there would be more, and the Saturday after that, and that Lila would probably have opinions about the flip timing, and Sophie would explain the bubble system with great authority, and Evelyn would stand at the counter with her coffee watching both of them and wearing an expression she didn't know he'd memorized. It was ordinary. It was going to stay ordinary. And that was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. He finished the water, rinsed the glass, and turned off the kitchen light. Tomorrow morning, Sophie would wake up and want pancakes. He would make them. That was enough. That had always been exactly enough.